He is one of the defining faces of 80s pop.
This is a very, very talented man who's making some unusual music.
He's the go-to guy for slightly groovy soul, pop rock.
Big drum sound, big ballads, killer songwriter.
Phil Collins was born in 1951 in Hounslow, London. His mother was a theatrical agent, whilst his father worked in insurance. Despite appearances on the stage, his interest was in music from an early age.
Phil Collins was brought up in a very show business friendly family. His mum was a theatrical agent. Now, children of theatrical agents tend to get quite a few acting jobs by some remarkable coincidence. And the young Phil was very much geared towards being an actor.
Phil Collins went to stage school and he was in a number of kind of films and stage productions as well. He was in Hard Day's Night and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. So he could have gone into movies, but instead he decided to stick with music and kind of persevere with that instead.
He was bought a drum kit as a very, very young boy, and he saw drums as the way to go.
I think he gravitated towards music because, it was the culture in the mid-60s. I think probably it was cooler and more fun to be in a band than it was to be at, National Youth Theatre or whatever. He was a fan of a band called The Action, who are a sort of mod band. He was in a band called Flaming Youth, who were quite good. Mid to late 60s, semi-psychedelic. I mean, this would be teenage years. He'd be a young guy. Music was at the heart of youth culture in the 60s, and I think he wanted to be a part of that. So that's where he gravitated towards, even though you would think he'd be set up for life as an actor.
As Collins was getting session work for the likes of George Harrison, he spotted an advertisement to join the band Genesis in the music magazine Melody Maker.
Phil Collins answered the advertisement in Melody Maker that bands invariably used at the time as a way of recruiting new members. He did his audition at Peter Gabriel's parents' house and he passed it. He was a better drummer than the drummers that Genesis had before, and clearly they thought that there would be some kind of personal compatibility there.
As soon as he was in the band, he was pressing on the songwriting aspects, and he really was kind of making his influence from the very beginning. I think he really pushed them into a more soft rock and more ballads area. He pushed them into a more pop mainstream and took them away from that kind of prog noodly sound.
Soon after Collins joined Genesis, lead singer Peter Gabriel left the band. After a string of auditions, it was decided that Collins would be best suited as the new singer.
He'd left and let nobody know. Gone were the towers he had known from a child, along with a dream of a life.
I think it's kind of beyond argument that Phil Collins changed the direction that Genesis were headed in. He might have not done straight away, but certainly when he became the singer in that band and moved away from being the drummer, he ushered in their more commercial, radio-friendly, unit-shifting era of the 80s.
They got no tail, they don't even know of our existence.
Phil Collins very much changed the direction that Genesis were heading in. The departure of prog-meister Peter Gabriel ushered in very much a new dawn, which dovetailed with Phil's own interests in, 60s soul music, Motown.
Whilst playing with Genesis, Collins simultaneously recorded with jazz fusion band Brand X. Here he began to experiment with drum machines and 8-track recording techniques.
I can feel it coming in the air tonight. All I want.
Now, for a drummer, to use a drum machine seems like siding with the enemy, the worst possible thing you can do. But he was clever about it because he used drum programming in this new fashion, along with live drums, and it sounded completely different. In fact, it sounded completely 80s. Now, this is the beginning of the 1980s, and so no one knew what the 80s sounded like. It sounded like Phil Collins.
People forget when he was in Genesis, when they were working with Brian Eno, he'd worked on Brian Eno's solo records, his first ambient records like Another Green Land. So he would have learnt a lot from working with Brian Eno.
He dealt in rhythm. And he became the first pop star drummer. But his albums weren't based around drums. They were based on rhythm and feel. And that's the feel that he brought to a Phil Collins album.
In 1981, Collins released his debut solo single, In the Air Tonight, which featured the sound he had created.
In the Air Tonight is a stunning track. It's musically very interesting. There's not much going on in it. It's very sparse. And I think for that reason, it really sticks out. You stop and listen to it.
It really defined the sound of a specific drum sound in the 1980s. And for good or ill, you know, all these people like Kate Bush, and I mean, everyone started using it.
It wasn't a typical song. It's an unusual song, and it's very, very modern, and yet the sentiment at the heart of it is something so completely human and so totally, you know, as old as the hills.
The track was the lead for the album Face Value. Collins had put Genesis on hiatus to save his marriage, and In the Air Tonight was about the breakdown of his relationship with his wife.
Face Value was something that he would never have been able to do under the Genesis banner. It was a very, very personal album. It was about his wife, Andrea, who'd run off with the painter and decorator. Hence his famous appearance on Top of the Pops with a bucket of paint and a paintbrush stationed on the stage, just to remind people that's why he was singing it. It was very open, it was very personal.
I think he started writing Face Value on the back of the decorator's notes. So, you know, if you want to get Freudian or whatever, I mean, the symbolism there tells 1,000 stories.
Certainly some of the songs on Face Value, they have a kind of cold detachedness that jars agreeably with the kind of bleak lyrics.
But I hide my feelings so no one knows.
He couldn't express it with Genesis, and he needed to make the solo record to lay these demons to rest.
That's where Phil Collins' solo career began. So in a weird sort of way, he's got, you know, the painter-decorator guy to thank for running away with his wife. He may never have written all those songs otherwise.
Although his second album, Hello, I Must Be Going, continued to focus on his divorce, his cover of the Supremes' You Can't Hurry Love was unsurprisingly upbeat. Due to its success, the track opened Collins up to producing more positive material.
It's a dream of give and take. You can't hurry love. No, you just have to wait. Just trust in the good time. No matter how long it takes.
It's a hugely encouraging song, both lyrically and in terms of its tempo and how it sounds. Phil Collins going back to the Motown music that he loved as a boy and celebrating that. It's an optimistic song of encouragement.
It's almost gone. Remember Mama said, no, you just have to wait. She said, love don't come easy. It's a game of give and take.
You see, there's two sides to Phil Collins. The really interesting side where he is playing drums for people like John Martin on Grace and Danger, and John Cale, you know, he's there with Brian Eno and Phil Manzanera when Cale's recording Helen of Troy. You know, really interesting alternative history to Phil Collins, and not very well documented or discussed. And You Can't Hurry Love, with all respect, is some little Motown knockoff.
Feel my strength. It's almost gone. Remember Mama said.
Some of the other aspects of the album showed him moving on from this divorce. And he was doing songs like The Voyeur and songs like I Don't Care Anymore. So you could see the sunlight breaking through the clouds of Face Value, and he was becoming his old cheeky chappy self again.
Long it takes and I break.
Phil Collins cemented his cheeky chappy persona with the 1985 album No Jacket Required. It took an upbeat direction and has sold over 20 million copies worldwide.
In Chicago, he was turned away for not being correctly dressed, i.e. having no jacket. And he was quite cruel and quite vicious about naming and shaming this restaurant. And in the end, they sent him a jacket, said they're very sorry and that he could eat at their restaurant and dress exactly how he wishes.
No Jacket Required, you know, we're all mates here. Actually, it was very clever and it was egalitarian and it was open to, you know, it was open to everyone. It didn't cut anyone out.
I think this album is Phil at his most radio-friendly, his most accessible and his poppiest. He's his most upbeat as well. I think he's finally kind of getting loose of the shackles of his past and his pain that he's gone through, and he's writing great big kind of pop songs.
No Jacket Required was where he became one of the faces of the 80s. Just the sound of that album is kind of 80s music. That is one of the albums that came hand in hand with the idea of the yuppie and the adult music buyer, and people were spending a lot of money on CDs.
Sussudio only got its title as Collins couldn't find a word to replace the ad-lib he made when improvising over his drum machine.
Sussudio was the first sign that, hey, this strange-shaped man could dance. There were horns on it, which, of course, is impossible to imagine on a Genesis record. But even on those early Phil Collins records, it was difficult too. It had a jaunt, it had the funk.
The cultural signifiers of the 80s, you know, shoulder pads, big hair, big cars, neon, aren't the kind of things that you associate with Phil Collins. Very much the opposite.
The Americans responded so well to it because they didn't have the baggage of Phil Collins being Phil Collins and Phil Collins being in Genesis. They just heard this funky record and thought, yeah.
His wide appeal helped secure him a starring role in the 1988 film Buster. Collins again put Genesis on hiatus as he produced 2 songs for the soundtrack, which both topped the US charts.
When I'm feeling blue, all I have to do is take a look at you. Then I'm not so blue.
You Can't Hurry Love had already established Phil Collins as the kind of, you know, middle-aged white bloke who likes Motown soul music. And Groovy Kind of Love was not Motown soul music, but it's a great old 60s song. And so he was almost the go-to guy for, you know, cool old 60s songs presented in a way that everyone could get into.
Anytime you want to, you can turn me on to anything you want to, anytime at all.
Buster was about Buster Edwards, who was one of the great train robbers. And Phil Collins spent a lot of time with Buster Edwards, who had a flower store outside Waterloo Station at the time. I mean, I think probably all that effort was wasted because Phil Collins went on to play Buster, how he'd been performing with Genesis as this cheeky Cockney chappie. And the film wasn't a great success, but Phil Collins was probably the best thing in it.
I think it's interesting that Phil Collins returned to films in his latter years. Obviously, he was theatrical as a child and he'd done music for a while, so maybe he decided to kind of pursue the acting. He's a fine actor. He's fun.
For his 1989 follow-up album, But Seriously, Collins took a different approach to songwriting. He used live instrumentation rather than the programming he had used previously. Lyrically, the themes were more serious, as demonstrated on the song Another Day in Paradise.
She calls out to the man on the street, "Sir, can you help me?"
He turned to writing more socially aware lyrics. He wrote Another Day in Paradise about the homeless situation. He wrote songs about the Northern Ireland problems at the time. He wrote songs about apartheid. Now, the opprobrium and the ridicule that was heaped upon him were overwhelming.
Another Day in Paradise is a good song, but there was that kind of earnestness that a lot of extremely wealthy pop stars were adapting at that time in light of Live Aid and all that kind of thing.
Oh, think twice, 'cause it's another day for you and me in paradise. Oh.
It chimed with the 80s period in which it was very popular for incredibly successful millionaire rock stars with sort of 3 homes and, you know, a fleet of cars to sing about the terrible inequality in the world and saving the children of Africa while, you know, flying by Learjet from one concert to another.
It's a fantastic song, very possibly his finest moment. I think he's very unlucky not to get the respect that he deserved. It was because it was Phil Collins. Had he put it out under a pseudonym, it would have been lauded as a great piece of social commentary.
In 1991, Collins recorded his last album with Genesis. We Can't Dance was an album that, like their previous effort, Invisible Touch, incorporated Collins' drum sounds and pop sensibilities. The band continued on, though, after Collins left for one more album.
Hot sun beating down.
I think that Genesis probably should have just split when Phil Collins split, basically. When Phil Collins goes, there's no point in Genesis existing. It's a bit of a disaster for them after he leaves. The records don't do well. Tour is cancelled, they go on hiatus. I think that was absolutely the right thing to do.
I can dance, I can talk. Only thing about me is the way I walk.
There were 2 very distinct camps of fans, and there were fans of the early era of the prog rock, Peter Gabriel era, and the Phil Collins era. But when he left, I don't think many people were enthused by their attempts to replace him. So yeah, that was definitely the end of Genesis.
On the beach, her dog's talking to me, but she's out of reach.
Collins focused on his solo material and film soundtracks after Genesis, but whilst his albums charted, sales didn't match the success of No Jacket Required.
Well, I got lost, couldn't find my way.
I think the later Phil Collins albums all had good moments. It's just, again, when you get really, really big at a certain period in history, it's almost impossible.
It always happens when you get that generational switch that you get guys who, or girls who, kind of epitomise the era that came before, that the new breed have been sent to destroy. And I think Phil Collins was the poster boy for what the young kids of the early 90s were trying to wipe out. But obviously that's in the UK, and when you go over to the US, actually he's quite revered amongst a lot of the hip-hop and R&B producers, which just seems bizarre for English music fans.
But every day I see, I try to make my heart be still.
Black America had no baggage regarding Phil Collins. They just heard these songs, which were unusual in that they had the percussive, rhythmic undertow that American soft rock didn't have.
He said that he'd had all this terrible press in Britain. He just accepted that no one was ever going to give him any good press ever. And then he turned the TV on and Ice-T was being interviewed, the rapper Ice-T, by some British guy on TV, and he was going through his record collection in LA. And he pulled out No Jacket Required. And the British guy said, "Phil Collins, that's a bit naff, isn't it?" And Ice-T went, "Hey, don't touch my Phil." And like,
Collins found success with the 1999 song You'll Be in My Heart. It soundtracked the Disney film Tarzan and won Collins the Academy Award for Best Soundtrack that year. 6 years later, Genesis reformed for an arena world tour.
Collins has sold over 100 million albums. That is an astonishing achievement. I don't think we should kind of forget that. It just doesn't happen often at all. I mean, absolutely, he's one of the greatest pop songwriters ever.
He is one of only 3 solo artists to have sold over 100 million records, and that he's up there with Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney and Phil Collins. It's quite incredible, really, when you think about that.
Particularly the first 4 or 5 solo albums you can see that this is a very, very talented man. And people responded to that.
Listen to the drum stylings, this very kind of jazz drumming stylings on things like John Martyn's Grace and Danger album. These are artists who continue to exert an influence, are still relevant, are still making music, and by his involvement in the sound of a particular record, he continues to have a presence, which I think is terrific. The secret history of Phil Collins might ultimately prove to be the more lasting.
He was underestimated then, he's underestimated now. The circle hasn't quite fully turned for him to be appreciated and respected. Maybe it never will, you know, but it's a shame.
This is my brother George. This is Mummy. She is always telling us we must never talk to strangers, no matter how nice they are. The other day, George was waiting for Mummy when a man came up and offered him a sweet. George shook his head. Then the man said, "Would you like to come for a walk or ride in my car?" But then George remembered what Mummy had said and hurried off to find her. Mummy was very pleased with him, and she said he was a very good boy.
So, children, if someone you don't know offers you something, always refuse. Never, ever talk to strangers.